It began as a routine instruction, delivered without ceremony and accepted without protest. The order did not promise distinction or disaster, only a delay measured in seconds, a small pause inserted into a much larger movement of men and machines. The position itself barely warranted attention on a map, a thin strip of ground pressed between broken hedges and churned soil, overlooked by higher ground and already scarred by earlier shellfire. To hold it for 60 seconds seemed almost polite, an administrative request framed as duty. The assumption beneath it was simple: the line would flex, the enemy would hesitate, and time would be bought cheaply. Morning light hung low and colorless, filtering through smoke that never fully cleared anymore. The air smelled of damp earth and cordite, with a faint metallic tang that settled on the tongue. Equipment lay where it had been dropped, webbing darkened by sweat, rifles resting against packs as if nothing urgent was expected of them. The men assigned to the position moved with practiced economy, checking fields of fire and sight lines without speaking, their familiarity with such tasks draining them of novelty or drama. This was not a heroic stand in their minds, just another measured contribution to a plan already set in motion elsewhere. The broader operation, though invisible from the position, pressed in on every thought. Columns were shifting behind the line, vehicles threading narrow roads, units disengaging under the promise of cover. Maps had shown clean arrows and tidy boundaries, but the ground refused to conform to those abstractions. Mud pulled at boots, wire snagged sleeves, and shallow depressions became shelter by default. The 60-second hold existed to smooth over those frictions, to allow momentum to continue without interruption. It was a small hinge meant to keep a heavy door from slamming shut too soon. Time at first felt generous. Watches were checked almost out of habit, not anxiety. The men settled into the earth, bodies angled to reduce exposure, breaths controlled to steady nerves rather than conserve air. Somewhere beyond the hedgerow, artillery muttered with distant impatience, a reminder that the front was never truly quiet. Still, there was space to think, to note the way condensation beaded on metal or how the wind shifted smoke across the ground in slow, deliberate waves. Training filled the silence. Each movement was anchored in repetition drilled long before, when outcomes had been theoretical and fatigue could be shrugged off at the end of the day. Those habits now governed posture and attention, narrowing focus to arcs of responsibility measured in meters. The simplicity of the task offered a strange comfort. Hold, observe, delay. There were no contingencies to weigh, no alternatives to prepare. The clarity itself dulled the edge of fear, replacing it with something closer to resignation. Yet even in that controlled calm, small signs intruded. A distant engine note rose and fell, not loud enough to identify but persistent enough to notice. The ground trembled once, faintly, as if testing its own stability. Birds that had lingered earlier lifted away, leaving the hedges unnaturally still. These were not alarms, merely signals that the environment was shifting toward engagement. The 60 seconds had not yet begun in earnest, but the space around them was tightening. The position offered little protection beyond concealment. Earthworks were shallow, hastily reinforced where time had allowed, and the soil crumbled easily under pressure. Visibility was uneven, broken by brush and smoke that could just as easily hide an approach as expose it too late. The men adjusted for these limitations instinctively, angling weapons to cover likely avenues, accepting blind spots as unavoidable facts. Holding the line here was less about dominance than presence, about forcing hesitation through uncertainty. As the minute approached, awareness sharpened. Muscles tensed not in anticipation of action but in preparation for endurance. The idea of 60 seconds, once abstract, took on physical weight, each imagined heartbeat a unit of measurement. The men understood that time under pressure did not pass evenly. Seconds could stretch into labor, each one demanding attention, discipline, and restraint. The assignment had been framed as simple, but simplicity did not equate to ease. Behind them, unseen, the larger formation depended on that brief pause. Vehicles needed room to turn, wounded to be moved, commanders to realign fragments of a shifting front. None of that complexity touched the ground they occupied, yet it gave the hold its meaning. The line was thin, but it was not insignificant. Its value lay entirely in duration, in existing just long enough to matter. When the first indications of enemy movement finally pressed against the edges of perception, there was no dramatic surge of adrenaline. Instead, there was a quiet narrowing of focus, a collective settling into purpose. The men did not count down aloud or exchange looks. They simply remained, anchored by training and expectation, ready to spend the allotted time as required. 60 seconds stood ahead of them, intact and untested, carrying with it the assumption that history would move on unchanged once it expired. The calm did not deny danger, it merely postponed its recognition. Within that delay lay the essence of the assignment, a moment stretched thin between intention and outcome. The men understood, without naming it, that holding the line was less about resistance than commitment, about occupying space until it could no longer be occupied. Their bodies pressed into the earth, senses tuned forward, they became part of the terrain itself, another obstacle to be worked around or through. Whatever followed would be shaped by these seconds, whether they ended quietly or were erased by force. For now, the world reduced itself to breath, pressure, and time, and the order remained intact, waiting to be fulfilled. Nothing else intruded, and nothing else was required, as the position settled into its brief purpose within the vast, indifferent machinery of war. In that stillness, obligation outweighed fear, and preparation replaced hope without ceremony or complaint from anyone present there. The 60 seconds were never marked by a signal. There was no whistle, no flare, no sharp line dividing preparation from execution. Instead, the hold began the moment the surrounding space started to feel occupied by something unseen. Sound carried first, a dull rhythm of movement pressed through the ground and air, uneven but purposeful. It was not yet close enough to define, but it displaced the earlier quiet, turning stillness into expectation. The men adjusted without instruction, bodies sinking lower, eyes tracing the same lanes they had already memorized. What had been assumed stable now showed its fragility. The broader withdrawal behind them moved slower than planned, constrained by damaged roads and vehicles stalled by terrain that maps had flattened into fiction. Messages relayed earlier no longer arrived with the same clarity or frequency. The line was holding, but it was also thinning, its edges fraying as units peeled away unevenly. None of this was visible from the position, yet it shaped the air, changing the meaning of every second spent there. The ground itself became an adversary. Mud clung to boots and sleeves, stealing small amounts of energy with each adjustment. The shallow cover collapsed in places, forcing hands to claw earth back into place while attention remained fixed forward. These were minor distractions, but under pressure they multiplied, demanding effort without offering resolution. The position asked for stillness, yet required constant correction to maintain it. Enemy pressure did not arrive as a rush. It crept in through confirmation, a shape where none had been before, a sound now distinct enough to separate from background noise. Movement gathered weight as it approached, turning possibility into probability. The men felt the margin narrow, not dramatically but persistently, as options compressed into fewer viable responses. The 60 seconds had begun to feel less like a buffer and more like a promise that had to be kept regardless of cost. Communication, once assumed, became tentative. Signals sent back received no immediate acknowledgement, leaving the position suspended between instruction and improvisation. The plan remained unchanged, but its context eroded. What was meant to be a brief pause now had to account for delays elsewhere, delays the men could not see or influence. The line they held existed in isolation, its success or failure determined by factors beyond its control. As enemy presence solidified, the terrain's limitations asserted themselves. Fields of fire overlapped imperfectly, gaps widening as smoke shifted and visibility fluctuated. Every movement forward or back altered exposure, forcing constant recalibration. The men compensated instinctively, leaning into training that emphasized restraint as much as aggression. Holding meant resisting the urge to respond too early, to preserve the illusion of strength for as long as possible. Time distorted. Seconds lost their even spacing, stretching under tension and compressing during brief lulls. Watches were no longer checked. The act itself felt indulgent, a distraction from what demanded attention. Instead, time was measured by progression. How close the movement felt, how loud the ground responded, how heavy the air became with unspent action. The 60 seconds were no longer counted, they were endured. Fatigue, already present before the assignment, surfaced in small betrayals. Hands shook when grip was adjusted, breaths came a fraction too quickly before being forced back under control. These signs were suppressed rather than eliminated, folded into posture and stance where they could not interfere. Discipline functioned not as rigidity but as containment, keeping physical strain from becoming visible weakness. The enemy's approach pressed the position into relevance. What had been a quiet delay now actively shaped movement beyond it, forcing caution and hesitation where speed had been intended. The line did not advance or retreat, it simply remained, absorbing attention and effort that might have been applied elsewhere. That absorption carried weight, though it offered no immediate reward or recognition. As pressure increased, The men understood that the original assumptions no longer applied cleanly. The hold was still required, but the cost was rising. Each additional second demanded more effort to maintain the same effect. The margin for error, once theoretical, narrowed into something tangible. A misstep, a premature response, could collapse the illusion of resistance and invite decisive force. Despite this, there was no sense of choice. The instruction had been clear, and clarity eliminated debate. Holding the line was not framed as bravery or sacrifice, it was simply the next action in sequence. The men occupied their roles fully, attention anchored to immediate tasks rather than outcomes. Thinking beyond the position offered no advantage and risked distraction. The environment responded to sustained presence with hostility. Smoke thickened, sound amplified unpredictably, and the ground reflected vibrations that unsettled balance. These conditions eroded comfort and certainty, reinforcing the sense that the position existed on borrowed stability. Still, it held, not through strength but through persistence, forcing engagement to proceed on its terms rather than rushing past. By the time the pressure reached its heaviest point, the original 60 seconds had become an abstraction. What mattered now was continuity, maintaining form under compression. The men remained fixed not because the plan demanded it, but because movement offered no better alternative. The line persisted as a constraint, shaping the unfolding engagement through its refusal to yield immediately. When the moment settled into a grim equilibrium, it became clear that the hold had already exceeded its expected simplicity. The position had absorbed more attention than planned, drawn out engagement longer than anticipated. This did not feel like success or failure, merely consequence. The line continued to exist, moment by moment, carrying the weight of decisions made elsewhere and delays not yet resolved. In that sustained pressure, the assignment transformed, no longer a brief pause but an active element of a battle still unfolding around it. Pressure increased without drama, a steady tightening rather than a blow. The enemy presence no longer felt theoretical, its weight pressing against the line through sound, vibration, and disciplined movement. Shapes resolved into forms, then into intent, as the distance closed by increments too small to measure yet impossible to ignore. The position absorbed this approach like a shallow trench fills with water, slowly at first, then all at once. Nothing collapsed outright, but everything grew heavier, requiring effort simply to remain unchanged. It demanded attention without offering resolution, turning patience itself into a consumable resource under continuous operational strain. Each passing moment drained options. Ammunition counts were not yet desperate, but every round now carried imagined scarcity. Muscles ached from holding positions that resisted comfort, and minor injuries announced themselves with persistent insistence. The original 60 seconds receded from memory, replaced by an unspoken calculation of endurance. What mattered was not how long they had been there, but how long they could continue without breaking form, discipline, or nerve under accumulating pressure. That internal arithmetic consumed focus, narrowing awareness to posture, breathing, and controlled restraint as external stimuli multiplied relentlessly around them without pause or mercy from any direction. Enemy pressure expressed itself methodically. There was no reckless charge, only probing movement supported by fire disciplined enough to test reactions without committing fully. This restraint forced the line to reveal itself through stillness, daring the defenders to respond prematurely. Every decision became heavier because it could not be undone. A single movement might clarify positions for both sides, altering the balance that delay alone was meant to preserve. The men learned to wait actively, holding tension in muscle and mind simultaneously while the environment amplified every error of judgment with immediate and irreversible consequences felt across the position continuously. Fatigue sharpened perception even as it eroded strength. Senses stretched outward, catching details that might once have been ignored, while the body resisted the demands placed upon it. Sweat cooled quickly in the open air, stiffening clothing and skin. Hands cramped around grips, then relaxed just enough to function. This duality defined the moment, heightened awareness paired with dwindling reserves, each feeding the other in uncomfortable balance. Training prevented collapse, substituting habit where conscious effort began to falter. It was not resilience, but procedure sustaining presence under conditions designed to strip both away through repetition and enforced calm alone together. The line's original purpose narrowed further as engagement intensified. Delay was no longer abstract. It was measured in enemy attention fixed forward instead of elsewhere. Fire exchanged intermittently, controlled enough to avoid escalation yet constant enough to signal occupation. The position drew pressure simply by existing, forcing the opposing force to respect it as an obstacle rather than an absence. That acknowledgement carried risk, but it also confirmed relevance. Resources expended here translated directly into time gained behind the line. This exchange, though unseen, shaped movements across the sector without producing any immediate visible victory or sense of relief afterward. As minutes accumulated, the cost became personal. Breathing grew deliberate, paced to suppress tremor and panic. Throats dried despite swallowed air tasting of smoke. Thoughts narrowed to immediate tasks, stripping away abstraction and ideology. War reduced itself to pressure against skin and bone, to choices made within arm's reach. In that compression, individuality receded, replaced by function and shared necessity. The line existed as a collective effort, not a series of individual acts. Responsibility blurred, spreading evenly across every occupied meter. This diffusion reduced fear by eliminating isolation while increasing the weight of failure proportionally shared by all present there. The enemy adapted incrementally, testing angles and responses with patience mirroring the defender's own. Each probe refined understanding, mapping resistance through reaction rather than reconnaissance. The line answered with restraint, revealing just enough to maintain credibility without surrendering advantage. This mutual caution slowed the tempo, stretching engagement into a contest of endurance rather than momentum. Time itself became the terrain contested most fiercely. Every additional second held altered calculations elsewhere along the front. Though unseen, those adjustments validated the effort expended here. Cause and effect stretched beyond immediate perception, binding this ground to distant outcomes still unfolding beyond sight lines. Physical stress peaked without release. There was no decisive clash to burn through tension, only sustained readiness that exhausted more thoroughly. Muscles trembled beneath enforced stillness, nerves raw from constant anticipation. The environment offered no respite, amplifying sound and motion until nothing felt neutral. Even silence carried threat, demanding interpretation rather than comfort. Sleep deprivation, already present, compounded every sensation and reaction. Judgment required active maintenance, resisting drift toward impulsive response. This discipline exacted a psychological toll equal to physical strain, yet it remained the only means of holding under conditions offering no margin for recovery or relief of any kind. The original timeline dissolved entirely. Whether 60 seconds had passed no longer mattered. The line persisted until displaced by necessity rather than schedule. This realization settled quietly, removing expectation and replacing it with acceptance. The hold would last as long as it could, measured not by clocks but by capacity. In that acceptance, effort steadied, focused on sustaining form rather than anticipating conclusion. The men adapted psychologically, conserving energy through narrowed intent. Hope was unnecessary, function was sufficient to continue. This mindset reduced distraction and prevented premature collapse by aligning expectation with reality as it presented itself without embellishment or denial. When the pressure plateaued, it did not signify relief but equilibrium. Both sides had adjusted to the line's persistence, incorporating it into their calculations. The defenders remained, neither advancing nor yielding, existing as a constraint rather than a force. This state, sustained and costly, represented the transformation of a simple delay into a defining element of the engagement. The line held, not heroically but completely, fulfilling its purpose through continued presence alone. Its impact extended beyond visibility, shaping outcomes without acknowledgement. This was endurance rendered into operational effect, measured quietly and recorded later without emphasis by those not present there. The minutes that followed carried the weight of consequence, each one expanding to fill the senses, compressing the horizon of thought to the immediate and unavoidable. The line had become a living measure of strain, a constant dialogue between endurance and pressure. Every shift of weight, every subtle movement of the hands, the shoulders, and the eyes contributed to an ongoing calculation of survival. The position had transformed from a simple pause in a larger plan into a nexus of tension, where the physical, mental, and environmental realities of war intersected in continuous, unrelenting detail. Time was no longer a marker but a force, shaping perception and dictating response with invisible authority. Enemy activity increased gradually, precise and deliberate, exploiting every terrain feature that offered observation and cover. The faintest movement in hedgerows or depressions drew attention and scrutiny, forcing the defenders to recalibrate continuously. There were no abrupt clashes, no explosive confrontation to break rhythm. Instead, the pressure manifested as persistent presence, each subtle advance a test of vigilance and stamina. The men understood this form of engagement, its demand for constant adjustment and quiet discipline was as exhausting as any frontal assault. It exacted attention, drained energy, and punished hesitation without spectacle. The terrain amplified every challenge. Mud, churned by previous maneuvers, clung to boots and equipment, each step a small exertion magnified over hours. Shallow earthworks eroded under rain, reducing cover and forcing micro-adjustments with each passing wave of precipitation. Smoke drifted across the line unpredictably, concealing some threats while exposing others, demanding constant reinterpretation of what could be seen and what could not. Even wind played a role, carrying distant sounds, masking steps and altering trajectories. The environment became a partner and an adversary, dictating both opportunity and limitation. Fatigue deepened in subtle ways. Muscles trembled beneath enforced stillness, shoulders stiffened from holding rifles, and every nerve became attuned to the smallest irregularity. Breathing was measured not just for function but for economy, suppressing noise, conserving stamina, and maintaining focus. Attention to posture, cover, and movement demanded energy equivalent to that of exertion. Each adjustment consumed more than muscle. It drew on mental reserves, threading anxiety, anticipation, and experience together into a continuous, demanding process. The men's endurance was tested not in spectacular moments but in prolonged, meticulous, cumulative effort. The line's significance extended beyond sight. What occurred here influenced the pace of distant units, shaping movement, delaying advances, and granting opportunities for regrouping or repositioning. This indirect effect was invisible, abstracted from immediate experience, yet every second of occupation contributed to it. The position's value was measured in temporal impact rather than terrain gained, in the quiet control of enemy initiative rather than the visible accumulation of victories. This made the hold no less vital and perhaps more consequential than any act of bold maneuver. Psychological strain accompanied physical pressure. Mind and body interacted in a continuous feedback loop where perception sharpened as fatigue deepened. Small sensory inputs, a shift in shadow, the metallic tang of disturbed earth, the faint echo of movement, required interpretation. Each detail became a data point for anticipating enemy intentions. There was no room for distraction, no margin for conjecture beyond the immediate scene. The men existed in a compressed now where all else was abstract, irrelevant, or dangerous. Discipline, training, and habit carried them through this invisible gauntlet. The enemy probed steadily, exploiting the smallest openings, testing reactions with disciplined patience. These actions revealed knowledge of terrain, timing, and human behavior, seeking to destabilize without overt engagement. The defenders responded in kind, modulating presence, aligning sight lines, and resisting instinctive impulses to overreact. Each adjustment was subtle, precise, and consequential. Engagement became a matter of controlled influence, shaping the enemy's perception and actions without initiating unnecessary risk. The contest existed as much in anticipation and resistance as in actual confrontation. Time became elastic. Moments elongated under anticipation and compressed under micro-engagements. Watches, once consulted regularly, became superfluous. Timing was measured through environmental cues, bodily response, and the shifting presence of the opposing force. The men experienced duration as sensation, not as number. Every heartbeat, every breath, and every adjustment of position was a tangible unit of measure. The original 60-second objective had faded into abstraction, replaced by a lived temporal reality defined by endurance, attention, and the unfolding flow of engagement. The line remained occupied through these pressures. Neither ground nor initiative shifted significantly, but the maintenance of position carried cumulative effect. The physical and mental expenditure ensured that movement behind the line remained possible, that units elsewhere had time to adjust, and that the enemy's tempo was subtly constrained. Presence itself was both weapon and measure, executed through repeated, precise action rather than bold statement. The line's significance was operational and quiet, its value measured not in immediate spectacle but in sustained consequence. As conditions persisted, adaptation became continuous. Rain, mud, smoke, and light shifted with no predictable pattern, requiring almost constant micromanagement of posture, visibility, and engagement. Equipment demanded attention even as bodies tired, from rifles that jammed or became slippery to boots heavy with waterlogged soil. These mundane details compounded under pressure, each small failure or oversight carrying operational risk. The line's survival depended on sustained attention to these accumulations, a constant layering of minor corrections that together produced strategic effect. Finally, as hours passed, the line became a measure of the limits of endurance itself. Physical exhaustion, environmental challenges, and psychological strain had interacted to compress the space of thought and action into a narrow, precise focus. Yet the defenders maintained their presence, adjusting minute by minute, sustaining the line through a combination of discipline, training, and sheer persistence. The impact of these hours was invisible in maps or reports, yet it shaped outcomes profoundly, illustrating how endurance under quiet pressure can redirect events as surely as the largest movements of men and machines. In this sustained occupation, the simple hold had grown into a defining element of operational effect, executed without fanfare, without recognition, but with undeniable consequence. The line had become more than a temporary obstacle, it had evolved into a fulcrum upon which the surrounding battle now pivoted. The broader context revealed itself gradually as the position's role shifted from mere delay to decisive influence. Reports, sporadic and fragmented, indicated that units behind the line were struggling to disengage, constrained by terrain and disrupted communications. Roads that had been clear enough for orderly movement now narrowed into churned mud and blocked passages, forcing vehicles and infantry alike to proceed cautiously. Every second the defenders held directly affected the survival of those following, transforming the position from a passive pause into a linchpin of operational continuity. The transformation of purpose intensified pressure on the men. What had begun as a routine hold now demanded vigilance in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Awareness extended beyond the immediate perimeter, encompassing the broader tactical landscape as best it could be perceived. Subtle cues, the distant whistle of artillery, changes in enemy movement, the shifting shadow of clouds over key terrain, acquired new significance. Each signal had to be interpreted in real time and factored into responses, bridging the gap between isolated experience and larger operational consequence. The position itself became a nexus of awareness, where absence or failure could trigger cascading effects across the battlefield. Enemy activity reflected the same careful calculation. Movements, still deliberate, carried greater intensity as the line's importance became apparent. Probes were more frequent, closer, and better coordinated, combining small arms observation with pressure designed to reveal defensive limitations. The defenders responded with an equal measure of discipline. Weapon alignment, cover adjustments, and observation became continuous acts of controlled persistence rather than reaction. Every micro-movement was informed by training and the increasing awareness that the position's endurance was now critical not just to immediate survival but to the continued cohesion of forces elsewhere. Physical strain escalated correspondingly. The environment compounded the difficulty, turning each adjustment into a minor struggle. Mud, rain, and uneven terrain demanded constant attention. Rifles became heavy with moisture, straps dug into shoulders and boots filled with water. Muscles burned from static tension even as small movements exacted effort. Fatigue accumulated not only as a physical cost but as a psychological burden, sharpening awareness while simultaneously threatening to degrade precision. Maintaining control over posture, breathing, and observation became both the task and the test. The line's survival rested on this delicate balance. Time continued to distort under sustained pressure. Moments expanded, folding past and present into a single experience dominated by observation, calculation, and endurance. The original 60-second hold was no longer a reference. The line now existed in continuous temporal flux, measured by proximity, pressure, and effect rather than any mechanical watch. Each heartbeat, each cautious adjustment, represented a contribution to the operational whole. The men were no longer merely waiting, they were maintaining a fragile equilibrium that ensured survival and operational continuity, with consequences that extended well beyond their immediate perception. As the hold persisted, small but cumulative impacts became clear. Enemy units were delayed, forced to redirect attention and adjust timing, while friendly forces found marginally greater space and security to maneuver. The position's endurance subtly dictated tempo elsewhere, illustrating the strategic weight of even brief, localized actions. There was no spectacle, no overt display of force. The effectiveness of the hold lay entirely in persistence, discipline, and quiet calculation. In this way, the line exerted influence disproportionate to its size or immediate visibility, embodying the principle that small, sustained actions can shape larger events. Psychological pressure mirrored physical strain. Concentration required continuous reinforcement, as even minor lapses could compromise the line's integrity. Thoughts were disciplined, filtered, and compressed to immediate realities: cover, enemy position, visibility, environmental changes, and equipment functionality. The mind remained active, alert to nuance, yet restrained, preventing distraction or premature reaction. Endurance demanded mental as well as physical control, a continuous negotiation between awareness and suppression, anticipation and restraint. Every sensory input was interpreted through the lens of survival and operational effect. The line's significance became increasingly evident in the subtle interactions between observation and movement. Enemy probes, while limited in scale, revealed data incrementally. The defenders' responses, controlled and measured, shaped the adversary's perception and subsequent actions. This quiet exchange defined engagement more than any overt battle. It was a contest of presence and timing, endurance and restraint. Success relied not on immediate resolution but on the ability to influence enemy behavior through consistent occupation and disciplined reaction. The line functioned as a shaping instrument, its effect measurable in delayed action and preserved cohesion elsewhere. Environmental conditions continued to test resolve. Rain intensified, saturating uniforms and equipment, while wind shifted smoke unpredictably, sometimes revealing enemy positions and sometimes obscuring them. Terrain challenges persisted. Ruts and depressions made footing uncertain, and cover required continuous maintenance to remain effective. Small adjustments became repetitive rituals, performed without hesitation or reflection, sustaining presence and operational functionality under unyielding conditions. In this relentless application, the line endured not through chance but through disciplined, repetitive action. By the time the positional significance was fully realized, the line's occupants had internalized the demands. The initial simplicity of a 60-second hold had evolved into an ongoing, complex responsibility, defined by continuous presence, disciplined adaptation and awareness of wider operational consequences. The defenders' endurance ensured that the larger withdrawal and repositioning efforts could proceed, however gradually, while the enemy's calculated pressure was absorbed and mitigated. The moment had shifted from routine assignment to operational keystone, its effect shaping outcomes quietly without recognition, yet profoundly. The line had become a fulcrum, its stability determining the shape of movement, the rhythm of engagement, and the continuity of forces beyond immediate perception. The hold finally began to yield, not through dramatic collapse but through the gradual exhaustion of human and material endurance. Hours of relentless pressure, environmental strain, and continuous vigilance had taken their toll. Weapons were heavier with mud and moisture, muscles ached from static tension, and senses burned from prolonged alertness. Each man felt the accumulation of effort in subtle betrayals, a tremor in the hands, a twinge in the back, the sting of cold rain seeping through soaked clothing. There was no fanfare in stepping back. The withdrawal was a measured, collective act of persistence giving way to necessity. The line's significance remained undiminished, but its form shifted, transferring influence to the units now moving through the terrain it had delayed. The enemy responded with the precision that had characterized their engagement throughout the hold. As the defenders receded, probes became less tentative, exploiting previously concealed approaches while avoiding the risk of overextension. Each movement required calculation, not just for immediate safety but to maintain cohesion and minimize exposure. The withdrawal demanded the same attention to detail as the hold itself. Cover was re-established after every step, lines of sight recalculated, and every small action measured against the broader operational impact. Fatigue made every choice heavier, yet discipline ensured that execution remained precise, preventing the exposure that could unravel the entire maneuver. Environmental obstacles continued to dictate the rhythm of movement. Mud remained thick and treacherous, forcing careful navigation of every step and constraining vehicle movement. Rain persisted intermittently, soaking clothing and reducing mobility, while smoke drifted unpredictably from distant fires, alternately masking and revealing enemy positions. The terrain that had offered partial advantage while holding the line now demanded respect to facilitate retreat. Every adjustment, whether for footing, sight line, or firing position, required effort and attention, compounding fatigue and underscoring the physical cost of sustained occupation followed by withdrawal. The psychological strain of relinquishing the line was as tangible as the physical effort. The men had internalized the significance of the hold, understanding that their endurance had afforded time and space for units behind them. Pulling back meant trusting that the consequence of delay would be realized elsewhere, that their efforts would ripple through the larger operation even as direct control ended. This awareness demanded restraint, patience, and collective trust. Hesitation, whether in movement or judgment, could compromise the very advantage earned through endurance. Each man bore not just his own fatigue but the responsibility for outcomes that extended beyond his immediate perception. Enemy behavior mirrored the disciplined attention of the defenders. They pressed, but with caution, probing the withdrawal to assess its rhythm and integrity. Fire remained controlled, aimed to test rather than annihilate, and movement exploited gaps revealed through observation rather than assumption. The interaction was continuous, a silent negotiation conducted through presence, timing, and adaptation. The defenders' retreat, executed with precision, limited exposure while shaping enemy perception, ensuring that the hold's operational effect persisted even as physical occupation ended. Time, once elastic and immersive during the hold, returned to a linear measure, but the sense of duration remained weighted by effort and attention. Each minute reflected cumulative strain, every small task, from repositioning equipment to navigating terrain, adding to the layered cost of the engagement. Even as the line dissolved, the memory of continuous vigilance, of sustained attention and endurance, lingered in muscle memory, instinctive posture, and sharpened senses. These traces ensured that the operation retained continuity, transferring responsibility seamlessly to units now occupying the area without reliance on immediate guidance. The line's indirect impact became apparent as the withdrawal unfolded. Units following behind could now advance with marginally greater safety, benefiting from delayed enemy action, disrupted observation, and the time afforded for repositioning. Ground previously static shifted incrementally, guided less by combat than by calculated endurance and disciplined withdrawal. The operational effect, though invisible in isolated moments, was concrete in cumulative consequence. The hold had not merely paused the enemy, it had reshaped the battlefield's rhythm, preserving options and safeguarding maneuver space for larger formations. Fatigue and attention remained intertwined during the withdrawal. Muscles, already taxed from prolonged static hold, now burned from movement against uneven terrain. Breathing was deliberate, both to conserve energy and to suppress noise that might betray position. Every action was calibrated, repeated with conscious precision. Even minor errors risked exposure, collapse of formation, or unnecessary engagement. The men had internalized the demands of continuous presence. Now the same discipline guided their retreat, ensuring that operational integrity endured despite shifting roles and changing physical requirements. The environment continued to assert influence throughout the withdrawal. Rain softened the ground, slowed movement, and reduced vehicle mobility. Smoke obscured lines of sight, occasionally concealing danger while at other times revealing exposure. Terrain features that had been navigational aids during the hold now constrained movement, demanding constant adaptation. The defenders' understanding of these factors, sharpened through hours of occupation, guided the retreat, demonstrating the interplay of human judgment, environmental awareness, and operational necessity in sustaining effectiveness under stress. As the line finally dissolved, its impact extended silently beyond the immediate perimeter. Enemy movements were shaped, delayed, and channeled by the persistence of occupation. Units behind had gained time, options were preserved, and broader operational continuity was maintained. The defenders had transformed a simple pause into a strategic fulcrum through endurance, discipline, and precise execution. The cost was tangible in fatigue, strain, and cumulative effort, yet the effect was enduring, invisible in spectacle but profound in consequence. The hold was over, but its influence persisted, a quiet testament to the power of controlled presence in shaping the flow of battle. The aftermath was not a moment of celebration but a quiet reckoning. The position, once a focal point of tension and exertion, now stood emptied, its soil churned, its earthworks flattened in places by persistent occupation. The men moved with deliberate care, each step measured against lingering fatigue, the weight of equipment, and the lingering echo of sustained alertness. Every movement carried memory of hours spent under pressure, the compression of time that had expanded and contracted with every heartbeat. Breathing was still cautious, even as adrenaline ebbed, a remnant of the alertness that had been demanded for survival. The terrain itself bore witness. Mud tracked across paths, makeshift cover disturbed, and distant craters that had held water now reflected overcast skies, all evidence of the line's invisible toil. Units behind the former position began to advance or reposition, their movements carefully coordinated but inevitably shaped by the minutes earned through endurance. The delay had allowed the larger operation to absorb the friction of terrain and enemy action, enabling forces to maneuver with slightly more security than they might otherwise have had. Commanders noted the time gained, the opportunity to consolidate, and the preservation of cohesion across the front. The hold's effect rippled outward. What had seemed a minor assignment became an operational hinge, and the men who had held it, through sheer presence and discipline, had exerted influence far beyond what any individual could perceive. The cost, invisible in maps or reports, was etched into every strained muscle, every line of sweat-soaked clothing, and every exhaustion-laden step. Physically, the soldiers bore the imprint of hours of static endurance followed by careful withdrawal. Muscles cramped and joints ached, though the pain was tempered by relief at movement. Rain-soaked boots squelched against churned mud. Rifles metal slicked with moisture, were heavier than memory suggested. Even small adjustments, repositioning packs, adjusting shoulder straps, or wiping water and grime from sights, required concentration and care. The environmental impact of weather, terrain, and prior occupation continued to influence every action, as though the battlefield itself demanded acknowledgement for the strain it had imposed. Survival, at this point, was measured in the maintenance of control over body and mind, in small victories of endurance against the lingering fatigue that threatened to dominate. Psychologically, the line's occupants transitioned from constant vigilance to a reflective awareness of the impact they had imposed on the broader battle. Awareness of strategic consequence remained, though filtered through exhaustion. The men understood that their hold had shaped enemy tempo, disrupted advances, and afforded vital time to their comrades. The satisfaction was quiet, devoid of fanfare or ceremonial acknowledgement. Recognition came in the knowledge that, without their sustained presence, larger operational outcomes might have shifted, perhaps imperceptibly but significantly. Survival and effect had been inseparable. The act of holding the line was itself an operational instrument, executed without drama but with profound consequence. Enemy forces adjusted in response, consolidating their positions and recalibrating strategy based on the defender's endurance. Movements were deliberate, reflecting the information extracted from prolonged observation of the line. The absence of immediate confrontation during withdrawal did not diminish the operational lessons learned. Every response, hesitation, and adjustment on both sides had contributed to a tacit understanding of capabilities, limitations, and discipline. The battlefield had absorbed the interaction silently, translating endurance into constraint, and constraint into altered maneuvering. The influence of a line held beyond expectation was therefore recorded not only in surviving units but also in the behavior and planning of the opposing force. As units continued to move through the sector, the effects of accumulated fatigue and environmental challenge persisted. Troops shifted positions slowly, cautiously, conserving energy while maintaining readiness. Supplies were checked and adjusted, weapons cleaned and inspected, communications re-established. Every minor task carried the dual burden of operational necessity and the residue of prior exertion. Yet despite the toll, cohesion remained intact. Training and discipline ensured that function persisted even as physical and mental reserves were depleted. The men's experience demonstrated that the cumulative impact of endurance could be leveraged effectively, sustaining operations long after the immediate crisis had passed. Time itself resumed its ordinary flow, though it now carried a new dimension of meaning. Moments that had once felt like infinitesimal fractions, seconds stretched by tension, anticipation, and fatigue, were now recognized as units of consequence. The hold, once abstractly defined as a 60-second task, had extended far beyond expectation, each incremental moment contributing to outcomes that were only now visible. The soldiers' understanding of time had been fundamentally altered. They had measured it through presence, effort, and persistence rather than by clocks or orders. This temporal imprint would remain long after the engagement, shaping memory and operational judgment in ways imperceptible to outside observers. In the quiet spaces left by the line's occupation, the battlefield began to resume its ongoing rhythm. Footsteps, vehicle tracks, and repositioned equipment marked movement but lacked the acute tension of earlier hours. The land, however, retained traces of struggle, churned mud, disturbed vegetation, and the faint scent of spent powder and smoke. These physical markers were accompanied by the less visible but equally enduring imprint of human presence and endurance. The strategic effect of the line, its delay, persistence, and influence, persisted in operational planning, influencing subsequent movements, engagements, and resource allocation. Ultimately, the hold's significance was measured in the subtle ways it shaped outcomes rather than through visible triumph. Survival, time gained, and operational continuity were its lasting legacies, recorded in after-action reports, unit movements, and the quiet recognition of those who had endured. The soldiers had executed an assignment that had begun as routine and simple, yet it had expanded in scope and consequence through persistence, discipline, and awareness. The line's endurance was a testament to the power of human presence in war, modest in spectacle, profound in effect, and enduring in memory. As the campaign moved forward, the battlefield's flow carried the imprint of the line's influence. Terrain shifted under continued occupation, units repositioned with slightly more safety, and enemy forces adapted their timing and approach. The silent negotiation between pressure and presence had concluded, leaving outcomes reshaped and future engagements subtly affected. The men who had held the line longer than expected carried fatigue, awareness, and a sense of measured accomplishment. Their endurance, quiet yet decisive, had carved a space of survival in the broader machinery of war, a reminder that even in absence of immediate recognition, persistence can determine the course of events. In the end, the aftermath was not marked by celebration or dramatic acknowledgement but by the steady continuity of operations, the quiet reshaping of the battlefield, and the preserved lives of units dependent on the time gained. The line had fulfilled its purpose, transforming a simple instruction into a decisive factor in operational survival. Its effect would endure in strategy, movement, and memory, a testament to the disciplined, unglamorous courage that underpins the mechanics of war. The soldiers' efforts, recorded in subtle shifts and delayed advances rather than headlines, embodied the essence of sustained endurance, quiet, relentless, and consequential.